have them take the actions that they take and don't take and get what they do and don't have. What is that? And I'll give you a hint. Comedians are the best at picking this up. Because what do comedians do? They get this something about a person, like George Bush, right? They get George Bush, this thing about George Bush. And what is comedy, right? Especially if you're like mimicking people. And you take George Bush and you take him out of his context and you put him in with the dolphins, right? And you could just, that's what makes it funny, right? And that's what they say, comic relief. Yeah. What is that? What are you relieved from? It's implicitly you're in that. Why imitating is so funny is because you take somebody who doesn't belong in this context and you have them be the same in the wrong context, and everyone goes, ha 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 ha. There's a release. What the fuck are you released from? You're released from your fixed point of view. You implicitly get, right? That's what a lot of what humor is and why it's so relieving, is it exposes the fallacy of the way that we think, right? As we talked about, and looking looks inside the lines. Seeing sees the lines themselves. Comedians have it see the lines themselves, and then we look ridiculous to ourselves because we actually constructed the prison, and the key is on the inside, and we have it in our hand, and we complain about being in prison, right? That's what makes it funny, But what is that they get? If we make this the content now, what is the context that has this be fixed or consistent? What is that? What do you get about people? What am I like? What am I like? Describe me. Let's see if we can get it that way.
Quirky.
I'm quirky.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
Use a lot of humor.
Humor.
Caring.
Caring. And what are you describing?
Qualities.
Qualities of what?
Of your behaviors.
Uh-huh.
Your...
Now my camera can take pictures of my behaviors. Right? So it's not my behaviors you're describing.
The way you behave, or the
way you almost got it.
The way I perceive you behave.
Are you describing my way of being?
Yeah.
I have a way of being.
Yeah.
Right? I have a way of being.
Yeah.
Your parents have a way of being.
Yeah.
Right?
Which I pick up in your body language and your tone.
In my tone. What else?
The words you
The words I use. Yes, totally.
Mm-hmm.
So we could say way of being. People have a way of being. When we say, I really know you, right? What do we know exactly? Such that we know how they're going to sing, right? We get their way of being. And Shana was really good at picking up on that is actually a gestalt, right? There's this kind of whole guy. She used the word like quirky, brilliant, funny, all those things, but it's hard to, you can't really define it. It's just a whole. But if we were to make it more distinct, let's break it up into 3 distinctions, okay, and see what happens, right? Let's say that this is your way of being, okay? So, one sphere is based on how I be. What would you say is kind of like the fundamental, like if I had a fundamental sentence that was underlying everything I do, right? Like a fundamental narrative from your perception that would make sense, right? This is because there's that, well, I'll call this the mental or linguistic sphere.
Uh-huh.
What do you say it is?
For you?
Yeah. And I'll do you too.
Life is fascinating and endlessly discoverable and undiscoverable, and paradoxical.
Great. Now, let's say that was a compensation. Right? Let's say that was like on top of something. What would you maybe think maybe would be a narrative underneath that?
Something around maybe being bored or unseen.
So maybe it has something to do with like being bored or unseen, such that I make sure, right, that it's exciting, right? Could be.
Exciting and ever changing.
Never changing, right?
Ever changing. So then that also leads me to go back to underneath it. Maybe if something's ever changing for you, then it either stays alive or maybe even safer somehow.
So check it out, right? She's starting to get me, right? You just crawled inside of me in my shoes, and you started to get me, right? And you're like, oh, if you started to make it, you started to make sense out of my experience, my behaviors, right? So basically, this is the linguistic sphere, right? These are basically our deep core fundamental narratives, right? And anything we can say about anything, right, is either an I want to make sure this is yes, okay. It's either an I, the Wilbur folks will get this, a we, or they, or it's an it. Right? So if we have narratives, it's going to be a narrative that is always going to be inclusive. Wherever we say I, we infer another and an it. Right? So you could say that this, another way of saying this is like, you could say, way of being is a way of describing like the practicing of your identity. Right? So you could also say identity. Right? And really when you start to talk about your identity, that's more about language. That's more about narratives, right? So, it's arguable, but I think that there's a much deeper identity, right, that isn't based on that. So, imagine that, so first of all, since this is what most people talk about, this is really conscious, isn't it, for people, right? Not always, right? Like, the results and outcome, pretty conscious. Actions, maybe not as much, but pretty much, right? The way it is, they're hyper aware of, but they're not conscious at all of that. They're the source of how it occurs, right? At all, hardly, right? Very few people make that distinction. It gets more unconscious. And that how they see is the source of how the world shows up for them, not the what shows up. Conscious, unconscious. Pretty much unconscious.